Okay, party people in the house, you're about to witness something you've never witnessed before.
Hey, hookers, how is everybody doing? Y'all, I just decided to come live tonight and do a book reading on my cult. I know I was supposed to be doing my part two to my Waco Branch Davidians, but I just don't feel like putting the time in to do any research. But I have a whole lot of books of cults because I've always been interested in religious cults. So I thought I would do a book reading and do a few chapters. And I'm going to try to do these book readings every week. So let's get started. And I know that you guys are probably tired of all of the yelling and screaming going on because God knows I'm sick to death of hearing it. So that's why I decided to just go ahead and come on and do some stuffies for everybody in the room here. Let me just speak to everybody. Bright, Risa, Hudson, Kayla, Sasha, and Bright Street. Alrighty, and I am dual streaming on my Auntie 3, which is my, true crime channel, but I just figured I'll just go ahead and do it on my main as well. Okay. So this book here is called Seductive Poison, and this is a book by a previous a member of the Jonestown. It's a Jonestown survivor story of life and death inside the People's Temple. So she was actually a very prominent member of the cult, and so this is her experience in the group. All right, let's begin. So this is the foreword. In April 1978, Debbie Layton Blakely was still in Jonestown as I was taking up my new assignment for the Washington Post in Buenos Aires. We didn't know each other then, nor would we meet for many years to come, yet our lives would soon be intertwined. That spring 20 years ago, Debbie, increasingly worried about conditions in Jonestown, was about to make a decision that would reverberate around the world. I was a young reporter intrigued by the prospect of covering wars and revolution in Latin America. Buenos Aires was my first foreign assignment after having spent 5 years covering local politics in the Washington suburbs. I knew that reporting, especially from countries where leftist guerrillas were battling right-wing military governments and where the press was often suspect, could be dangerous. But no one had ever mentioned cults or being shot at by Americans. In fact, I think it would be safe to say that in April 1978, no one at the Washington Post, or probably in Washington, had ever heard of the People's Temple or Jonestown. As I was en route to Buenos Aires from the United States, it is entirely possible that my Pan Am flight overflew Guyana, the former British colony turned socialist cooperative republic of Guyana, located lost, might be a better word, on the northeast bulge of South America. I had no way of knowing that down below, Debbie Layton, her mother, and some 900 other Americans were living as virtual prisoners in the Guyanese rainforest. Jonestown, the utopia they had promised before they left San Francisco, was essentially a Potemkin village. Nor was there any way I could possibly have known that 7 months after arriving in Buenos Aires, I would be shot and nearly killed because of the fateful decision Debbie would make in May 1978 to escape from Jonestown to seek help for her mother and for hundreds of other members of the People's Temple that she believed were being held in the jungle camp against her will. There were probably many things that could have triggered Jonestown's fiery end, but sadly, it was Debbie's decision to escape and seek help that became the catalyst for what is still perhaps the most bizarre and tragic episode in the history of American religious movements and messianic cults: the mass suicide murder of more than 900 of Jim Jones' followers on November 18th, 1978. For weeks, Jonestown will remain front page news, not only in the United States, but around the world. Even today, I suspect there are a few Americans over the age of 30 who don't remember where they were when they first heard that more than 900 of their countrymen had killed themselves having drunk Flavor Aid laced with cyanide in a place called Jonestown. At the time, as horrified and as fascinated as they were, it was easy for most Americans to dismiss the People's Temple as a bunch of crazies, people not like us, and to dismiss what happened in Jonestown as solely the result of religious fanaticism, or the craziness of the times, or the bizarre hold of charismatic leaders like Jim Jones, and more recently, David Koresh and Marshall Applewhite, on a particular group of ignorant, emotionally greedy, confused, or simply naive followers. Yet, Jonestown did not happen in a vacuum. Cults and cult-like groups had begun to proliferate during the 1960s in the United States in reaction to the profound political, social, and sexual revolutions then underway. For many Americans, especially many young Americans, the civil rights and anti war movements provided a very real sense of liberation. Yet others could not cope with the new freedom and the consequent disintegration of family structures, institutions, and traditional values. Drugs, sex, rock and roll, dropping in and out all became a part of the new culture. But nobody was supposed to get hurt. There weren't supposed to be consequences. So the awful reality that hundreds of Americans, men, women, and children, had died of cyanide poisoning in the Guyanese rainforest came as a real shock, even to those enveloped in their own psychedelic haze. Instantly, Jonestown entered the lexicon, an ominous warning to all those Americans who sought meaning for their lives and truth by experimenting with all manner of quasi religious, quasi psychological, quasi libertarian, or quasi authoritarian self help movements and cults. Jonestown would demonstrate in bold relief just how dangerous these groups and their leaders could be. In December 1977, when Debbie Layton arrived in Jonestown from California for the first time, she had already been a member of the People's Temple for nearly 7 years. Indeed, she was one of Jim Jones' favorites, a member of the inner circle. Yet it did not take her very long to conclude that Jonestown was not the idyllic refuge she and all the others had been told it was before they got there. Just 24 at the time, Debbie quickly realized that she and the others had been deliberately deceived. Jonestown was essentially a concentration camp in the jungle. Unlike many temple members, though, Debbie was clear headed enough to recognize that Jim Jones, the man they had given their lives to and had believed in without reservation, was increasingly paranoid, psychotic, and dangerous. That process of realization led her to contemplate trying to escape, even if that meant risking her life and leaving behind her mother, terminally ill with cancer, who had herself escaped from Nazi Germany 40 years before. The parallels and ironies are chilling. Both Debbie and her mother Lisa were obviously tough and intelligent women, survivors alert to the very real dangers around them. Yet both were initially at least taken in by Jones, the false prophet they chose to believe and follow. Just as many German Jews of Lisa's parents' generation were somehow deluded into thinking that Hitler would never carry out his threats against them. Neither Debbie nor her mom was deranged, nor were they unstable women abnormally susceptible to the appeal of a charismatic preacher slash politician. People join cults unwittingly. Even reasonable, intelligent people can be fooled by demagogues, and too often, the deeper they become involved in one of these quasi religious or quasi political groups, the more difficult it may be to see the potential dangers. As Debbie makes clear in this memoir, both she and her mother were searching for a life with meaning, not unlike so many other Americans at the time and at that time and since, except that their search led them to the People's Temple and Jim Jones. Having escaped from the Nazis, it was Lisa's fate to die in Jonestown. During the few hours I was in Jonestown, It became apparent to me that there were a variety of reasons why people had joined the People's Temple. For some, it was a political statement. Jones offered the promise of a socialist society free of materialism and racism at a time when such a society was particularly attractive. For others, the temple offered religion, structure, and discipline, a way to escape the violence of the ghetto and the dead end of alcohol and drugs, which was strictly forbidden. But Jones cleverly manipulated both his followers and public perceptions of what he and the People's Temple were all about. And that is the larger lesson yet to be widely understood. In both California and Guyana, the People's Temple were allowed to become a state within a state, enjoying the privileges and acquiring the legitimacy that allowed it to thrive over many years. Meanwhile, that legitimacy hid Jones's increasing paranoia and his increasingly erratic demands for control and for power. The First Amendment's guarantee of freedom of religion makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to investigate religious organizations, even when, as was the case with the People's Temple, they deliberately seek political power to shield their immoral and illicit practices from investigation. Jim Jones was a housing commissioner in San Francisco, courted by the mayor, the governor, and Rosalind Carter, even while he was raping young members of his church, stealing their parents' money, staging fake healings to impress the ignorant, and threatening, perhaps even murdering, those who attempted to defect from the temple. Jones's appeal to the politicians may be difficult to understand now, but it was simple, and he understood it better than they did. In 1968, the Democratic National Convention and Mayor Daley had put the final nail in the coffin of old fashioned political machines in the United States. But to win, politicians still had to campaign and get out the vote on election day. Jim Jones was smart enough to identify the void in the political free for all that was San Francisco in the 1970s. He had the only political machine in town. Because he had absolute control over his own followers, Jones could and did produce legions of campaign workers for favorite candidates that made sure their supporters got to the polls on election day. Shiva Napal, whose book Black and White is, in many ways, the best examination of the politics of the People's Temple, describes the peculiar political culture in which it thrived. Among his many questions, Naipaul asked Jones's political allies if they felt they had been taken in by him. Strangely enough, what Nepal found was that Willie Brown and most of the others with whom he talked were unapologetic, even a year after having lost most than 900 of their constituents to poisoning in the Guyanese jungle. How could they have known? Did they have an obligation to find out? These were the questions that didn't seem to register with Brown and the others. Jim Jones was always a charlatan, but his delusions and paranoia grew more pronounced as he grew more powerful. The same could be said for the jungle retreat in Guyana. Whatever its initial reason for being, over the years, it evolved into a terrible charade where appearances and reality grew further and further apart. To the outside world, Jonestown was portrayed as a kind of multicultural kibbutz, I don't know how to pronounce that, populated by willing pioneers determined to forge a new life in one of the world's most remote and inhospitable environments. Visitors, including consular officers from the U.S. Embassy in Georgetown, Guyana's feted capital, were fooled into believing that Jonestown's residents were well fed and well cared for. In the end, it was the press, that other reviled institution protected by the First Amendment, not the prosecutors or the political establishment, which finally began to pierce the veil and reveal the truth about the People's Temple. Only then Jim Jones fled California for Guyana, setting in motion the awful tragedy that would soon follow. To me, that tragedy, the mass suicide murder of more than 900 of Jim Jones's followers, and the bloody ambush that preceded it, seemed as if it happened yesterday. I can still remember vividly the call from my editors in Washington several days before, telling me that a congressman from California, Leo J. Ryan, would be leaving California the next day to investigate some crazy cult group in Guyana. I was in Caracas interviewing voters and politicians for a story I was writing in Venezuela, their upcoming presidential election. The trip and the coverage had been approved, but now it could wait. I was told, "We want you to meet up with the congressman. It sounds like a more interesting story." I wasn't entirely convinced. But the next day, I flew from Caracas to Trinidad, where the congressman's flight from San Francisco and New York was stop en route to Guyana. It was nearly 10 p.m. as we took off on the final leg of that flight to Georgetown. For the next hour, I was told chilling stories about Jonestown. According to a group of relatives aboard the plane with Congressman Ryan, the Jonestown commune was a hellhole where armed guards, torture, tranquilizers, sleep deprivation, and above all, misplaced faith had combined to trap hundreds of innocent people against their will. Jones was described as a good man gone bad, a charismatic figure who led his followers astray, a sadist, a megalomaniac, the devil incarnate. People were starving in Jonestown, I was told. There wasn't enough food, water, or medicine. Anyone who complained or expressed doubts was beaten or worse. I listened, but I was skeptical. How could nearly 1,000 Americans be tricked into leaving California for Guyana? How could they not have known what they were getting into? Could any of what I was being told possibly be true? For 3 days, the congressman, his staff, the concerned relatives, and a small brigade of journalists, my colleagues, waited in Georgetown. Jones and his lawyers, Mark Lane and Charles Gary, did whatever they could to stop us from reaching the jungle commune, which was located about 300 miles from the capital near a tiny Guyanese village called Port Kaituma. Finally, on Friday, November 17th, frustrated by what he perceived to be stalling tactics, the congressman announced that we would fly to Port Kaituma that afternoon and try to enter Jonestown with or without Jones's permission. Yes, Jonestown was technically private property, and yes, the People's Temple was technically a religious institution located in a sovereign country. But the congressman said Jim Jones had no right to stop a United States congressman from determining for himself whether anyone in Jonestown was being seriously mistreated or held there against his or her will. What I didn't know at the time was that much of the congressman's information and urgency was the result of an affidavit David had written shortly, Debbie, goodness, had written shortly after she escaped from Jonestown the previous May. In effect, it was Debbie who convinced Congressman Ryan that the situation was serious enough that he should investigate. And the longer Jones stalled, the more determined the congressman became to reach Jonestown. At about 4 p.m. that Friday, we boarded a tiny Guyanese Airways plane that had been specially chartered for the hour-long trip. There was room for no more than 24 passengers, so most of the relatives were forced to remain behind. Although they didn't think so at the time, in many ways they were fortunate. Just 24 hours later, the congressman and three of the journalists aboard the plane would be dead, and most of the rest of the world wounded, victims of the mass hysteria that was about to ensue. The airstrip at Port Kaituma was nothing more than a clearing in the jungle. No terminal or tower, no lights in case of darkness, and no mechanic in case of trouble. The landing strip wasn't even paved. It was mud, like everything else in the rainforest. Once on the ground, the congressman, his staff, and the two temple lawyers were taken immediately to the commune about 5 miles away. The rest of us were held at gunpoint by the local sheriff for about an hour until Jones sent another dump truck to the airstrip. The relatives and all but one of us journalists would be allowed to proceed. I will never forget my first impressions of Jonestown as we made our way through the simple wooden gate and continued down the long muddy road toward the central pavilion. What I saw reminded me of a southern plantation before the Civil War, not so much because of the architecture, but because of the scene. To one side of the large wooden pavilion was a communal kitchen where women, mostly black, were cooking large vats of stew. Others were baking bread. Young children were playing in what appeared to be a schoolyard. Still, other members of the temple, black and white, young and old, were eating their dinner in and around the pavilion, which served as both an open air dining hall and a meeting place. At the center of the pavilion, seated at the head of a long table, was the white master, Jim Jones. He was an arresting man, his hair dyed jet black. Although he had a kind of commanding stature, it also quickly became clear that he was unnerved by our presence. As we journalists gathered round to ask questions, he responded rationally one minute, emotionally and irrationally the next. Threat, threat of extinction, he bellowed in response to a question about Debbie Layton and others who had defected. I wish I wasn't born at times. I understand hate, love, and hate are very close. I wish I wasn't born sometimes. Those were his words, recorded and played back many times since. Yet, despite his odd behavior, there was no visible evidence of starvation, torture, or initially at least, that Jonestown's residents were desperate to leave. We saw no guns or signs of the kind of intimidation that the concerned relatives talked so much about. Considering its location, Jonestown itself was rather impressive. But those first impressions would not last. Jones refused to allow the journalist to remain in Jonestown overnight, so we were sent back to Port Kaituma to sleep on the wooden floor of a tiny bar. That night, as we drank beer and rum, we learned from the sheriff, the same sheriff who had held us captive at the airstrip just hours before, that there were indeed guns in Jonestown and that several members of the temple had tried to escape. Some of the escapees, he told us, had been covered with bruises that could have been the result of torture. We also learned that Jones's worst fears were coming true. At least one family had secretly told the congressman they wanted to leave with us the next day. We were back in Jonestown early, and it was immediately clear the mood had changed. NBC correspondent Don Harris was preparing to begin a tough interview with Jones, asking about the guns we've been told about, the allegations of torture, and the family that wanted to leave. Meanwhile, I heard muffled coughing from a large wooden building that looked like a tobacco shed. Inside, a group of elderly women, most of them black, were living in clean but extremely cramped and primitive quarters. It was a side of life in the commune Jones had not wanted us to see. Tension built as the day wore on. There was crying and hysteria at the pavilion. Families were being torn apart as some of their members told the congressman they wanted to stay while others wanted to leave. Jones himself, said to be running a fever, looked and sounded as if he were a defeated man. Then, toward mid afternoon, after most of us were already aboard the dump truck that was to take us back to the airstrip, one of the temple loyalists attempted to stab Congressman Ryan. There were more screaming. As several of us rushed toward the pavilion, Ryan emerged uninjured, but his shirt was covered with blood. He was okay, he told us. The blood belonged to his would-be assassin who had been stabbed after someone grabbed him from behind. Finally, at about 3 p.m. that Saturday, we were ready to leave Jonestown. We made our way slowly toward the airstrip. It seemed as if the worst was over. And even then, I was unconvinced that Jonestown was as bad as it had initially been described. Yes, some 20 members of the temple had decided to leave with us, but more than 900 others had decided to stay. Yes, conditions were harsh, but there was no evidence of malnutrition or serious physical abuse. Yes, Jones seemed psychotic, but despite everything, he appeared to have many devoted followers. Two planes were waiting for us at the airstrip, where we had arrived less than 24 hours before. Because the defectors, as we called them, were fearful, the loading began almost immediately. They couldn't believe Jones would allow them and us to leave in peace. They were right. Suddenly, without warning, a tractor pulling a hay wagon appeared at the end of the airstrip. There were there was near panic as the defectors rushed to get on board the two planes. The tractor began moving toward us. I was standing by the door of the larger of the two planes, trying to help the defectors get aboard, when I saw the tractor crossing the runway. I still wasn't sure what was happening or why it was moving toward us. Then I heard pop, pop, pop. It was then I realized that people were running, diving for cover, screaming. The popping sounds were gunshots, and they were becoming louder as the tractor moved closer, ever closer. Death was making its way across the runway. I understood instinctively that it would soon reach me. The gunmen were now rounding the front of the plane, so I ran toward the tail. There I was faced with a life or death choice. If I ran straight, I would have to cross the broad open expanse of the landing strip. It seemed better to turn left, where out of the corner of my eye I could see others were taking cover behind the wheel of the plane. I threw myself down behind the wheel. But within minutes, seconds maybe, the shots were coming from behind. The gunman had circled from the other side of the plane. Now they were directly behind the wheel where we had sought protection, and they were going to kill the rest of us. Dirt sprayed into my face as the bullets tore into the earth nearby. My only thought was, if I lie very still, maybe they'll think I'm already dead. Then I felt a powerful jolt and a terrible sting. A bullet had struck my hip. Thoughts of my family and friends rushed through my mind. Bullets were still coming. I could hear them. I could feel the dirt. I was going to die. There was a hill. There was a lull. Then three more shots, spaced maybe 30 seconds apart. Very close. Very loud. Bang, bang, bang. Then silence. A minute passed. Maybe two. I heard the plane's engine begin to rumble. I opened my eyes without moving my head or body. I could see down the flat expanse of runway. The tractor and the gunmen were moving toward the end of the airstrip, slowly retreating in the same direction from which they had come. My only thought was that if the plane was going to leave, I was going to try to get on it. I jumped up, not knowing if I could walk. I wobbled a bit, but as painful as it was, the bullet had only grazed my hip, and I could manage. I ran around to the door and threw myself aboard the plane, but it couldn't move. One of the engines had been damaged by the gunfire. Only then did I realize the enormity of what had happened. Lying on the airstrip were seven bodies. Congressman Leo J. Ryan, dead. NBC correspondent Don Harris, dead. NBC cameraman Bob Brown, dead. San Francisco Examiner photographer Greg Robinson, dead. Patricia Parks, one of the defectors, dead. Anthony Katsaris, one of the concerned relatives, badly wounded. And Steve Sung, the NBC soundman, badly wounded. Inside the other plane, there were two more seriously wounded people. Both were defectors shot by a third Temple member posing as a defector. Ironically, that third defector was Larry Layton, Debbie Layton's brother. And all four of the congressman's original party were dead and 12 wounded, including myself. After the shooting, the Guyanese pilots secretly gathered in the smaller of the two planes, which had not been damaged, and flew back to Georgetown without telling us. As night fell, we knew there would be no way out until at least the next morning. We treated the wounded as best we could and tried to find protection for ourselves, fearful the gunmen might return. It was a nightmare. But what we didn't know then was that another nightmare was just beginning 5 miles away. In the early evening hours of Saturday, November 18th, 1978, after the gunmen returned from the airstrip and reported that the congressman had been killed, Jones called his followers to the pavilion. The temple was under attack, he told them. The temple had been betrayed. It was time for all loyal members of the People's Temple to commit revolutionary suicide. They had practiced so many times before. There was some resistance, but not much. After a rambling harangue, George Jones urged his followers to die with dignity. The fatal liquid, flavor aid mixed with cyanide, was then poured from a wash tub into small cups and distributed. One after another, some 900 members of the People's Temple, many of them parents with children in their arms, drank the poison. Then they huddled together around the pavilion, writhing in pain, waiting to die. Those who resisted were forced to drink the poison at gunpoint. Jones, however, chose to die in a different way. He shot himself, or was shot, at point blank range on the floor of the pavilion, surrounded by his wife, Marceline, and other members of the temple's inner circle. By the time I got there, 36 hours later, the first journalist to reach Jonestown after the suicide murder, hundreds of bloated bodies, mosquito infested and rotting in the hot tropical sun, were piled two, three, sometimes even four deep in the area around the pavilion. Jones's corpse lay at the center. Guyanese soldiers had secured the compound, but otherwise had done very little. The vat, half full of the deadly purplish liquid, was still there. The only survivors were several members of the armed security squad, whose job it had been to force others to drink the poison. They were then supposed to drink it themselves, but somehow they had survived, and their eyewitness accounts provided the first information of what had happened. They started with the babies, was what I was told by the security squad, and that's how I began my reports in the next day's Washington Post. Even the dogs had been poisoned. Debbie Layton survived Jonestown by escaping, and Seductive Poison is her account 20 years later of how she got involved with Jones and joined the People's Temple, blah, 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 blah. All right, let me do a quick intermission. Let me drink me some water, and we'll begin with the actual story. That was just giving y'all some background.
How many times I gotta tell you bitches you can't fuck with me? How many times I gotta tell you hoes you look dusty? How many times I gotta tell you bitches you can't fuck with me? How many times I gotta tell you? How many times? How many times? How many times I gotta tell you these lines? How many times I gotta tell you he's mine? How many times I gotta tell you bitch back off cause you look a mess? Yes, I'm blessed, never been stressed. My nigga take me to the Virgin Islands like yes, bitch, cause that's what I gave him first. How you feel burnt like whoa? How many times I gotta tell you bitches you can't fuck with me? How many times I gotta tell you hoes you is dust?
Oh, that song gets me every time. All right. This is the prologue. Driving over the San Francisco Bay Bridge at 4:30 in the morning, preparing, as I have for the past 10 years, for another hectic day on the trading floor of a brokerage firm, I listen to the radio. I hear people talking about a strange cult called Branch Davidians that have been surrounded by the FBI. My mind and heart began to race as I recognized ignorance in the questions and comments about the group. Authorities are misguidingly speculating about why the cult members have walled themselves off against the world in a dangerous standoff. I wonder, are they really provoking it or are they being forced into an impasse? I am sure that it's the latter. My head fills with the voices I've tried to silence, mothers whispering, babies crying, grandmother weeping softly. People are running. I can smell the dust as it's scattered into the air by the chaos. Father's calling. I can barely hear the radio any longer. Someone is saying the authorities are blasting music into the Davidian compound. Floodlights are being focused directly on buildings to frighten and force the inhabitants out. Perhaps they'll use tear gas. Entrapped, imprisoned, alone, frightened. I can hear their thoughts. I feel their pain. I understand what keeps them inside and afraid to surrender. I've been in their shoes. I am one of them. Old tapes are running in my head. Memories pole vault me backward into fear and insanity, back into the darkness, into Jonestown. I see the pavilion in the center of a compound cut into the heart of the jungle. People are running. I hear their anxious voices. Father is calling us. Father's voice is filled with emotion. He's shouting over the loudspeakers broadcasting through the camp. Danger is near. I can hear a siren in the background. Security alert. White night. White night. Quickly wake up. We must get to the safety of the pavilion. Run, mothers. Hurry, children. We must make it to the safety of the pavilion. I sit up, slightly disoriented, awakened from a heavy and abysmally dreamless sleep. Jumping down from the bunk, I grope on the wooden planks, unable to find my boots. I fight with my pant legs to allow my feet entrance. Christ, it must be past midnight, god damn it. I don't want to die without my boots on. I don't want to fight the enemy in my socks. Fumbling around in the dark, I'm frantic. I'm frantic that I'll arrive late to the pavilion and be confronted and punished for taking too long. My shirt smells of sweat from days of field work. Finally, I grab my worn and tattered boots, crusty with mud from the torrential rain last night. I scramble to the outside stairs where the moonlight is bright. I see other residents rushing, pulling on shirts, zipping up pants, stumbling out of their cabins, some with babies in their arms, most alone, running us to what we're told is safety, the pavilion, our sanctuary, where Father will protect us. I can hear gunfire in the jungle surrounding us. Father warned us that mercenaries are out there. Every day he warns us about the enemy, the others out there who are against us. I can hear by the gunshots that they are coming closer. He was told and told and told us that they will harm us. With each blast of the siren, our existence in Jonestown becomes more tenuous. I'm frightened. I don't want to be murdered. I've done nothing wrong. These poor black grandmothers have done nothing wrong. Please, why must they hurt the children? The children were brought here by their parents, young adults who thought they were giving their babies a better life, a life free of racism, and oppression. Here in Guyana, the promised land, we would have a chance to live life to its fullest because Father had promised it would be so. Voices on my car radio draw me back to the present. Armored vehicles are on their way to the Branch Davidian compound. I feel panic rise up inside of me. Oh God, I should do something. I should contact the FBI, warn them about their tactics. I know that their harsh, combative language will only entrench the victims further. Who in their right mind would flee to the safety of such intimidation? Hasn't the FBI understood by now how the mind of a captive perceives danger? If only I could help. If only I could stop the insanity from happening again. But what would happen to me if I came forward? How would I protect my secrets? How could I spare my little daughter? In my memory, I hear more gunfire blasting up from the jungle. The howler monkeys won't bellow their songs tonight. They sense the insanity around them. I race on in my mud-caked boots, past tin-roofed cabins, past the wooden outdoor showers where we've allowed our 2-minute wash at the end of our 12-hour days in the field. The cool air tries to invigorate my tired mind. Why again tonight? It seems every week we're told we'll die. Every week we're ordered to drink some liquid. Every week we're promised death, a relief from this miserable life. I hope tonight's the last one. I'm so desperately tired. Perhaps death is better than this. I wonder if my friend Annie will be in the pavilion in time to avoid Father's wrath. Is someone helping Mama up the narrow path from her cabin? I climb the fence near the podium and sit down close to Father. His big white chair has armrests, a seat pillow, and a back to lean against. Everyone else sits on hard benches or on the dirt floor. All of us assume our positions, knowing that it will be many hours before we will leave the safety of the pavilion. White night becomes day, another night of lost sleep, facades, into the dawn. My butt numb, feeling suffocated, reflexes stiff, the inside of my mouth raw and aching from biting it to stay awake. I continue to listen to Father's ravings about our prophesied demise. When the sun rises and heats our exhausted bodies, the gunfire has ceased. The mercenaries we imagine are resting through the heat vacuum, an intense throbbing that sucks our energy and absorbs our very essence, then dries it like jerky. Automatons sit in the pavilion now, hungry only because we are reminded to be by the whimpering of the famished children. We are shells of humans waiting for our next instructions from Father. Suddenly, Father informs us that we have been saved by a miracle. The mercenaries have departed, and we are now free again to enjoy our lives. He dispatches a few of the kitchen staff to prepare a little sustenance for his entrenched warriors. Exhausted, we sip our rice water soup and nibble on breadcrumbs from an earlier meal. A new day hath arrived. Father begins to hum, and the pianist begins her melodic accompaniment. He stands and sings, we shall not, we shall not be moved. We shall not, we shall not be moved. Smiles and claps his hand. We all sing along. Once again, we have fought the enemy and won. Since the destruction of the Branch Davidian cult, my mind has returned again and again to my past. It is brought back to this darkness because of the inquisitive questions of my 6-year-old daughter. Mommy, where is Grandma Nanny buried? Why can't we visit her grave? The tightly wrapped secrets of my past are being cautiously opened. Secrets handed down from my mother to me. Untruths that spurred us both. While looking for answers into another deceitful world, People's Temple. I thought I could keep the past hidden forever, the way my mother did when I was growing up. But that's no longer healthy or possible. I must return to the suffocating confusion of my youth to understand my sorrow, make sense of my shame, and integrate the secrets of my unclaimed history. I must break the pattern of well-intentioned deceit passed from parent to child. Why is Uncle Larry in prison? He isn't bad, is he, Mommy? How can I explain to a child that my brother became a pawn the moment I escaped from Jonestown? My mother was dying of cancer. He was the only hostage Jones could use to try and coerce me back or force me into silence. My brother must have been severely threatened, perhaps in panic, when he followed orders to shoot at the people. Why is the only one held accountable for the insanity designed by Jones and unwittingly implemented by a thousand of us? I was one of them, on my own with no one to answer to. I have kept my shame locked in a small compartment just beneath the surface. But my daughter's innocent probing has emboldened me to face the horror again after 20 years. Why didn't you just leave when Jim got mean? I'm not sure what took me so long to comprehend and finally heed the danger signs. Was it my naivete? Perhaps it was my childlike belief in my own papa's goodness that kept me from grasping the truth. Being a good, obedient daughter seemed incompatible with having questions and doubts. Couldn't the children have refused to drink their juice, Mama? I would have closed my lips tight and not allowed them to do it. How can I make her understand what people are liable to do under extreme pressure or in a desperate need to please? How they can choose to take their own lives rather than disobey and risk an even more violent death at the hands of either the enemy or the armed guards of their own group. I'm propelled by my daughter's innocence to turn inward to my cavern of painful, frightening memories. But facing them requires that I first learn how to cope with the shame. I must face my acts of treason against my mentor and friend, Teresa B., whose trust I betrayed for my own survival. In order to prove my devotion to the People's Temple, I devoutly reported her secrets, condemning her to a purgatory from which she barely escaped. It does not help to explain that all of us were taught to spy and report on each other, our families, our loved ones, our friends. Loyalty to father required it. Any longing for friends or lovers, any expression of love for our family was a breach of that loyalty. Thou shalt have no other God before me. I never dreamed of reporting on my mother. The only alternative was to withdraw. It took all my strength to hide my fear for her. I worried that she might put herself into grave danger by being honest, by confessing to Jim her fears and misgivings about Jonestown. Mama's secrets remained safe with me, and yet I'm still haunted by the fact that I saw no other choice than to forsake her. I knew the pain my slow withdrawal caused her. She was afraid in Jonestown, sick with cancer and desperate for my companionship, but I was unable to give her the love and affection she needed. When she needed me the most, I escaped and left her behind. I abandoned her in order to save myself. How could we do such awful things? Why were we unable to see the corruption, call Father's bluff, stop it before the end? We had embarked on a peaceful exodus into a land of freedom, only to see our lives in the promised land turn into a dreary prison camp existence. Our dreams evaporated into 12-hour days of hard labor, watched by armed guards from morning to night. We hardly got enough food to sustain ourselves, and many of us fell sick from malnutrition. Sundays meant standing in a long line, snaking from the radio room where Father sat in the doorway, down the wooden walkway. Thousands of us moved slowly as Father spoke personally to each resident, handing out the special weekly treat of a sweet cassava cookie. Finally, I too would stand before him as he lovingly bequeathed the delicacy to me. Debbie, my little warrior, he would sadly smile. It has been a tough week, but toughest on me. I carry your hopes and dreams upon my shoulders. It is I who worries about you and your future while you sleep. Here, my child, enjoy my offering, my treat. The kitchen staff made it for you, even though the ingredients are too expensive and we can't afford such a luxury. Thank you, Father. I will lower my eyes respectfully and walk away, allowing the next residents their moment with Father, keeping my thoughts to myself. But as I walked away, I wondered why we didn't have enough money when Teresa, Carolyn, Maria, and I had deposited millions of dollars at Panamanian bank accounts. Teresa and I had flown to England, France, and Switzerland to open even more accounts. Carolyn and Jim had said we needed to do this so the government couldn't take it away from us, and that Jim would use the funds for the people when the time came. Why was Father acting as though we had nothing? Why was so many millions of dollars abroad? Could we barely exist? It makes my heart ache to think how bravely and how desperately we endured. Only very few people were lucky enough to have been elsewhere when the suicide command was given. Those in the capital, some 250 miles away, refused to take their lives when Father's orders came over the radio. Just that little bit of distance allowed them to think for themselves, and they chose to live. Those of us who survived are left with the task of making sense of the losses suffered by so many. The survivors, whether they lived in Jonestown or were only associated with People's Temple in the United States, must live with the quiet and dull vibration that agitates our conscience. We have compartmentalized our shame, despair, and fear, struggled to disentangle ourselves from our own misconceptions of who we were. In order to find answers for my daughter, I must find answers for myself, for the welfare of us both. I must descend again into the darkness. Although I am fearful of what I may find, I must remember. Chapter 1. The quote of the chapter is: We who have come back by the aid of many lucky chances or miracles, whatever one may choose to call them, we know the best of us did not return, which is a quote from Viktor E. Frankl. My mother was a mystery to me, beautiful, often quiet. She secretly sketched portraits of women, closing her portfolio whenever I came unexpectedly into the sunroom. I often felt I was intruding on someone unfamiliar and interrupting something quite private. She seemed like a shadow, her silhouette casting a haze on my imperfect form. Always gentle and kind, she coddled me and continually asked after my thoughts. I sensed that she was worried about me and desperately wanted to protect me, but I had no idea from what. In return, from a very young age, I felt protective of her. Every evening, she would lie next to me and read aloud. I loved the sound of her voice, soothing and warm. My favorite poem was Walter de la Mare's Sleepyhead. The way in which Mama pronounced each word lulled me into a trance. I begged her to read it over and over again, especially one segment. Come away, child, and play, light with the gnomes, in a mound green and round. That's where their home is. Home sweet, curds to eat, cream and frumenty, shells and beads, poppy seeds, you shall have plenty. But as soon as I stooped in the dim moonlight to put on my stocking and my shoe, the sweet, sweet singing died sadly away, and the light of the morning peeped through. After the fifth reading, when we finished saying the Lord's Prayer, I plead with her not to leave me. When she finally rose and kissed me gently on the cheek, then closed the door behind her, believing I was asleep, I would cry. She seemed so sad, like a fairy princess in a moated castle, and I grieved for her. My mother, Lisa, was born in Anita and Hugo Philip in 1915. Although she shared few of her childhood stories with me, I had glimpses into her past. It was my father who bragged about her life. I knew she was proud and had grown up in Hamburg, surrounded by vast amounts of art and culture. Concert musicians used to play in her extraordinarily modern home that was designed and built by her cousin through marriage, Ernst Hochfeld, a pioneer of the Bauhaus architectural era. There were built-in cabinets for the extensive art collection, a humidity control vault for Grandpa's tobacco and cigars, and the beloved music room where Mama's Steinway and her father's Guadagnini violin was kept. Mom explained on several occasions that the bronze nude in our living room was not an object to snicker at, but a famous sculpture called The Awakening by Klimich. These are all German words, y'all. And that she loved it. I understood that her father had packed it together with a few other valuables and brought it from Germany. While her parents hadn't hired a moving company to ship all their belongings from Hamburg, was a question that never seemed to be answered. There was the beautifully shaped silver cutlery used daily, some exquisite jewelry Mama kept in her silk embroidered jewelry box, and several large pieces of art, paintings, and sculptures that Grandpa Hugo and Grandma Anita had personally carried to America. I loved hearing the story attached to each one. There was an etching of Albert Einstein, signed by the genius himself, his hands so dirty his fingertips showed clearly next to his signature, and an etching of Pablo Casals, tuning his cello, signed by the maestro, Beatrice d'Este of Ferrara, the painting commissioned by my grandfather in Italy that stared away past me in the library, wore a headdress of leather and pearls and was covered in a maroon dress with a luxurious black velvet cape. I often wish the statue on the table, a beautiful bronze woman, her bared breast firm, her long, sleek legs taut as she stretched upward on her toes, had considered wearing clothes on the day of her posing. My mother's legs were beautiful, too. I loved to sit on her bed each morning and watch her pull her stockings up over her ankles, then point her toes and extend her legs into the air as she attached the silk to her black garter. My mother was what I wanted to be, an enchanting enigma. I sensed that my mother missed her life in Germany. The past seemed to consume and console her. When I was a little older, I wondered what it must have been like to leave a place one deeply loved, all one's friends and relatives, and never to see them again. But it was many years before I grasped that my mother's world was filled with sorrow, guilt, and regret. And it wasn't until years after that I learned why. Long before I came onto the scene, my mother had begun to spin a cocoon around herself. From the place of solace, she wove interesting stories and gave them to her children as protective shields against the painful truths she could not bear to tell. The one most closely associated with me was the story of my arrival. My birthday scene was a momentous occasion. I love the pretty stories of the long discussions and appeals for my big sister Annalisa for a baby sister. Mama too said she desired just one more baby. I grew up knowing that I was the only really planned for child because at age 8, my sister had successfully convinced my parents that she would take care of me. However, the truth was far different. It is only now that I realize my conception must have been on the evening of May 10th, 1952, the evening my mother learned of her own mother's suicide. I imagine the night was filled with tears and profound despair, my father holding and consoling my mother, trying to dissuade her from her crushing guilt. On February 7th, 1953, exactly 9 months after Grandma Anita's death, the secretly grieved about baby arrived in Tool, Utah. Although she cared for me deeply and listened intently to my never ending questions, she seemed sad, preoccupied, and sometimes in awe of me. Perhaps my presence reminded her of the mother she believed she had forsaken. Somehow, deep inside my mother's heart, she must have wondered from where my spirit arose. May 10th, 1952. My friends, know that I, free and proper, am a good American, but I was a gossip, and I have entangled in a network of intrigue. I no longer have the strength to free myself from it. Forget me not, beloved children and family, and you, Hugo, forgive me. Live well, all of you. Love mankind so much. A. On the morning of her suicide, Grandma Anita left behind what at the time seemed a mysterious missive written in German. No one understood why she mentioned being a good American. Sadly, however, Anita had a basis for her belief that she was entangled in some terrible intrigue. In 1951, my father had left his associate professorship at Johns Hopkins to accept a prestigious position as associate director of chemical warfare at the Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah. My mother was apprehensive about the assignment, as was her mother. Anita had become very involved with the American Society of Friends, i.e., the Quakers, the organization that had safeguarded her and Hugo's journey out of Nazi Austria to the United States. The Friends had kept the Nazis at bay while desperately trying to obtain the last of the emergency visas granted to Jews. On March 20th, 1940, the Friends gave Anita and Hugo the precious gift of another life in America. Now, Anita was a devoted friend and believed in their gospel of peace and nonviolence. Her son in law's involvement in research on how to kill humans with chemicals was abhorrent to her. She talked with her daughter about her misgivings and begged her to convince Lawrence not to take the job. In 1951, Anita could not know that after her son in law's arrival in Utah, he was promoted to chief of the entire chemical warfare division. With this high level appointment, Dr. Layton required the highest level security clearance possible, and the FBI began to conduct a thorough background investigation. My father, one of the government's top men at Dugway, was married to a German woman, an alien of enemy nationality, as denoted on her passport, and her parents had to be closely investigated. J. Edgar Hoover was in his prime. He was a xenophobe and believed in the Society of Friends to have communist leanings. Hoover's men, with little concern for the fallout of their investigation, began to question my grandmother and her Quaker friends. These men deemed it unnecessary to explain to the Society of Friends and neighbors of Anita and Hugo why they were investigating the loyalties of the Phillips. Anita had no idea that this was a routine inquiry regarding a government employee. All she knew was that people were asking questions about her. Anita wrote to her daughter that she was being followed and spied upon. Unaware of the FBI's investigation, Lisa and Lawrence thought Anita was becoming paranoid. To them, her fears were incomprehensible. Of course, she had been persecuted in Germany, and that was Nazi territory. It could not happen here, never in America. Terrified and not knowing where to turn, Anita jumped to her death from her apartment window. At the time, my mother did not know that her parents were being investigated, and she could not have fathomed the effect of such an investigation on a Jew who had escaped from the Nazis. Much later, I would discover how deeply my mother blamed herself for having disbelieved her mother's fears. Long shadows now loomed over Lisa's universe. The world she had hoped to escape into was suddenly soiled. In 1952, Mama had three children under age 10, a husband with an extremely sensitive government job, and a new baby on the way. For reasons I think I now understand, Lisa chose to silence her sorrows. For the sake of her husband and her children, desperately wanting to give them the future she had hoped for, she suppressed her past and hid her own identity as well as her mother. Lisa Phillip, born in Hamburg to non-religious Jewish parents, was raised a German, not a Jew. Her family never attended synagogue and were completely assimilated into the fabric of Germany's high society. Her father owned a seat on the Hamburg Stock Exchange. The family circle of friends were predominantly Jewish, but the Phillips often entertained government dignitaries and luminaries from the world of art and theater. On May 6, 1938, the life and world Lisa loved was wrenched away from her. At the age of 23, in order to escape the Nazis, Lisa bid farewell to her parents and her friends and boarded the SS Manhattan for New York. It was a hard transition. She was lonely and longed to settle down and attach herself to this new world. In 1939, a year before meeting my father, she wrote to her closest friend in Hamburg, Annalise Schmidt, that she felt worthless and alone. Her friend wrote in response, "You don't have anywhere to go when you are lonesome, but Lisa, you must not give up the longing for something beautiful. A strong love would be the most cleansing thing for you. The memory of the past are there, and you feel that you have been plucked from your past, but I'm sure that you will rebuild your roots. If you have a devil within you, don't hide him, but put him in front of your wagon so that he will use up all his strength by pulling you forward." My parents met while my father was in graduate school. Vastly different in every way, they found each other attractive and believed the other's attributes would help them secure the future of comfort and shelter they both longed for. Lawrence Layton had no secrets. He was born in Boomer, West Virginia, a poor coal mining town. Almost all of the inhabitants worked deep down under the earth, but Lawrence's father was different. John Layton was a college educated engineer. Life for Lawrence began a little better than for others in Boomer. His father spent hours with his son discussing ideas and allowing him to help perform experiments. But when Lawrence was 8 years old, his devoted father died unexpectedly. Within days, his mother was forced to move back in with her father, and she instantly became a servant. Lawrence Layton, the child who became a man overnight, resolved that his siblings would never feel his desperation or loss. He assumed the paternal role until his mother remarried. At that point, he was dealt another cruel blow when his new stepfather told him to leave the household. He was determined to rise above his lot in life, but his adolescent perceptions of desertion and betrayal became the basis for a lifelong fear of abandonment. By 1938, the year Lisa was torn from the life she loved, my father had escaped from his world of poverty and betrayal to the world of college intellectuals. Intelligent, enterprising, and assumingly confident, Lawrence was now lived far away from the cold town of his youth. He stylishly joined the Socialist Party and for the first time in his life met educated Jewish immigrants. He aspired to one day join the world of the bourgeois. In 1940, Lawrence was introduced to Miss Lisa Phillip, the physical therapist at Penn State Student Health Services. I believe it was my mother's cultured and affluent background that enchanted the young doctoral candidate. Lisa, a beautiful German, lent legitimacy to my father's own endeavors. Her distinguished lineage, her cousins, James Franck, won the Nobel Prize in Physics. Her uncle, Oscar Hirsch, was a world renowned Viennese brain surgeon, provided impressive credentials to the ambitious student from West Virginia. Desirous of making a life with promising roots for herself, Lisa began to date the PhD candidate, and in 1941, they became engaged to be married. But my father, who had remained chaste, was very troubled that his fiancee had been intimate with another man before him. Her culture and experience cast a shadow on his fragile self esteem. However, Lisa believed if they truly loved one another, her past could be forgotten. Fearful of any more upheavals in her already tumultuous life, my mother became apologetic, outwardly meek, and obedient. On October 18th, 1941, the marriage of 31 years began. Unfortunately, Lisa would never be able to bury her past enough to calm the demons inside her innocent country boy's head. In 1943, she made the following entry into her diary. There is one thing that is causing me to be more desperate and unhappy than I ever thought I could be, living as well as I do, having a perfect little son and a good husband. It is the opinion another person one greatly cares for has of one. I would have repented and tried to be as good a person as I could, but nothing seemed to be pulled out from under me. There is nothing I see, no ground to stand on. A few months later, she wrote a letter to her husband. Dear Larry, there is neither a going back to nor future. All I've ever hoped for seems to be denied to me. I want a home and children. I want to feel part of you. When things are all right between the two of us, my love for Tom is happy, and it fills me with contentment and a feeling of security to see him play and feel good. But when things are the way they have become now, my love for him is not a real, true, unselfish love because I try to regain my love for him, what I have lost in you. And since this is not possible, my love becomes desperate. You cannot believe my feeling toward you because you cannot feel it. You are a prisoner of yourself because selfishness prevents you from overcoming your limits. With three children under the age of 4, she was washing diapers and sheets by hand, hanging them outside of a clothesline to dry. She was weary, having to manage without servants and without the loving support of her own family. Her isolation grew when she could no longer share her thoughts with her German friend Annalise, as it was forbidden to communicate with anyone in an enemy country. Finally, when the war ended, Lisa excitedly wrote to Annalise, but the reply was devastating. Annalise and her baby had been killed in a British bombing raid. Lisa's only remaining lifeline to Hamburg, and her path was severed. As a child, I was mostly unaware of my parents' troubled marriage. If my mother was a mystery to me, I completely knew my father, or so I believed. There was never any doubt in my mind that my father was fiercely proud of his little Bugsy, his nickname for me, his small and energetic youngest child. I was sure it would please and annoy him. I was sitting on his lap and reading aloud to him on Sunday afternoons. I knew that Papa was a scientist and the smartest man in the world. I hung on his every word, knowing it was gospel. Papa eased the confusing world I tried to share with Mama, making it clear and black and white. I never had any doubts about what I should do, think, or say when I was near him. He made me confident by boasting of my accomplishments, my creativity. I had meaning in my life when I pleased my papa. Looking back now, I can see that learning to please in this way became a dangerous liability when I met Jim Jones. On the other hand, it was because of my father's unwavering belief in this little Bugsy that I would, at a critical moment, find the strength to flee Jim Jones and escape to safety. In 1957, Papa accepted a position in Albany, California, where he commenced research on allergies. In our spacious home in the Berkeley Hills, my older siblings huddled around me, lavishing me with eager attention, coddling and protecting me from myself. In return, I idolized, adored, and entertained them, reveled and blossomed in their attention, and became accustomed to unconditional love. There was so much noisy commotion around me that my parents often didn't get a glimpse of me all day. Papa encouraged my love of drama and ballet. At age 5, I was performing my own interpretation of Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake at dinner parties in our mansion at 670 St. Louis Road. There were always adoring whispers as my swan pirouetted across the hardwood floor, my tutus ruffling, gently rising and falling with each graceful landing. Afterward, Mama would hug and kiss her ballerina, and we'd head upstairs, hand in hand, for my good night story. Still, I was aware that I was not a part of the intimacy that Mama shared with my older siblings. One incident when I was 6 years old brought home the realization that I was excluded from my mother's world. My 16-year-old brother, Tommy, and Mama were sitting together on the front porch. They were talking, but I saw a thin trail of smoke rising over my mother's shoulder. I knew that couldn't be, as Papa had forbidden anyone from smoking. It was trashy, and only uneducated people did it. I also knew that what I had seen was a secret, which I faithfully kept to protect Mama. I longed to join Mama and Tom in their secret time together, and would later wonder why Annalisa and Mama always talked behind closed doors. What would my 14-year-old sister be talking about with her? What on earth could be so private? By the time by the time it was my turn to sneak behind the door with Mama, she seemed exhausted. She never shared with me the secrets of growing up. She never even told me the scary facts of how my body would change. In 1960, however, my dream world still glistened with sibling adoration. I continued to garner applause for my tomboy feats, such as the double flips on my parents' bed and the 25 stitches on my head I got from crashing into the corner of the headboard. My favorite time was evening. Papa would discuss his research and ask us about our days. Most often, the discussion was centered around the book Mama was reading and planned to discuss at her regular afternoon tea hosted at our home. My life living babysitters, Tom, 17, and Elisa, 15, and Larry, 14, still chased me around the house in the evening when we played Evil Tooth Decay. Tom and Larry would hunt for me behind couches and closets and under beds until I was found. I screeched with delight as they looked for me, then chased after me as I fled. Finally, I had to brush my teeth while Tommy, Mr. Evil Tooth Decay, growled and tried to prevent me from brushing. And Larry, Bucky, Beaver, protected me. When Annalisa had her high school sorority's monthly evening meetings at our house, I was their mascot. I would proudly sit on the table, ring the bell for the meetings to come to order, and play waitress to serve them refreshments. My siblings were always there to smooth the sometimes rough relations between me and our parents. That allowed me to remain the center of attention, the twinkling star. My father continued to write and publish his research, travel and give lectures in America and Europe. I never understood why my mother refused to accompany him when he lectured in Germany. I begged her to go and take me too, but she would look far into the distance and softly say, I will never go back. Her refusal to explain herself made me feel left out, frustrated, and furious at her. Then suddenly, one summer, Tommy disappeared, deserting me for the University of California at Davis. And Elisa remained behind, and although I remained her high school sorority's mascot at 9 years of age, I was becoming a fading star. Around this time, I started to tell really interesting stories to my friends. I believed these stories myself. I really was an Indian princess who had been adopted and taken away from my tribe. And Elisa scolded me for lying, but was unaware of how much it was becoming the fabric of my being. I earned a rather unpleasant reputation in the neighborhood and became known as Liar Layton. Then Annalisa deserted me for Davis, too. I still climbed trees and played kickball, remained the best at handball, and arguably was the bravest kid in the neighborhood. I could go out the farthest on any tree limb on the block. That the fire department had to be called to help me down was not a point against me either. I still knew that I had won. I was the biggest daredevil of all. If only my family were there to see me. But everyone was gone. I would have to use other means to catch someone's attention. I began to have conflicts at school. I felt completely justified in chipping the tooth of the boy who confronted me in the handball line and refused to apologize to him in the principal's office. I threw pebbles into the eyes of the girl who called me a liar. Some parents told their children to stop playing with me. I was too ashamed to tell my parents. Papa was not supposed to know that I wasn't his adorable Bugsy any longer. I tried to hide from Mama that her little baby girl was losing her charm. I still had one more sibling at home, Lawrence, but he couldn't take up the slack. He was focused on more meaningful things, philosophy, being pregnant of the Berkeley High School Democratic Club, and doing his homework every night. Getting his attention was far more time consuming and arduous than it had been before. I was forced to stand at his door, calling his name over and over. Lawrencey! I yelled until he threatened to get me. Then his exasperated count would begin. He would warn me that by the time he reached 10, I had better be gone. When he reached 10, I'd run and hide, but he never came and looked for me. Then he too cast me aside for the ominous black hole in Davis that sucked up everyone important in my life. I was 10 years old, and three of the most influential people in my universe had abandoned me. Absorbed by the pressing concerns of paying for three college tuitions, Mama began to work part time at the University of California at Berkeley's main library. Although she was only 10 minutes from the house, I returned home from school to an empty home. I remember climbing our tree and sitting high over the front porch, waiting for the postman, hoping for letters from my favorite people in the world. Few came. My exhausted parents, clueless about how cunning I become, were left alone to deal with the spoiled, pubescent daughter coming of age in the Berkeley of the tum- coming of age in the Berkeley of the tumultuous 60s. They had raised three perfect children, obedient, scholarly, and attentive, and now on their coattails came this wild, lonely, and angry adolescent. My parents were caught off guard. Papa became increasingly disenchanted with my tomboy behavior and publicly mourned the loss of his ballerina. When I transformed into a well endowed teenager, he continued to instruct me in what was right and wrong, who was good, the girls I could play with, how ladies should dress, how my hair should be. He combed off my face, and which people were not acceptable acquaintances. Life took on a bleak pallor in our empty mansion. Growing increasingly argumentative and surly, I pulled farther away from my enigmatic mother. I had so many questions, and none seemed to be adequately answered. Why, I asked her, was she so bothered by my playing with Jewish girls? Didn't seem any different to me. They all had pretty brown curly hair, and their parents really liked me. But Mama was troubled. Why do you like playing with Megan Hesterman and Carol Davis more than the other girls? She'd ask. I didn't know what Jews believed. How could I? I wasn't one. As Mama continued to fret and query me, I became more uncivil. Why are you a Nazi? I'd shout. I began to argue constantly with the sweet, soft spoken woman I had once adored, especially when she deferred to Papa about requests I had, like sleeping over at a friend's house. Can't you make any decisions on your own? I'd yell. I felt betrayed by her for reasons I did not understand, and I was confused by my wild anger. I could tell when Mama had been crying after my tirades. She tried to talk with me. She would pack picnics and we would drive into the countryside, just the two of us to talk. But the moment we were alone, I would attack her again or refuse to speak, just shrugging my shoulders. In 1968, my older sisters and brothers were again causing distress for me. Tom had passed his PhD qualifying exams at Harvard, and Elisa had married a biochemistry professor at the University of California at Berkeley, and Larry was involved in an organization doing humanitarian work. I was unable to compete. I wasn't interested in my classes and got poor grades. Unable and unwilling to emulate the achievements of my siblings, I was losing my status in a family of great achievers. It had become almost impossible to please my father, so I learned to deceive him instead. Mama, on the other hand, was becoming wise to my cutting ways and confronted me on several occasions. I believed I was unfairly forsaken and began to search for attention elsewhere at any cost. All righty. So I'm going to cut it there and we will begin the next reading. Guess I'll try and do one next Wednesday. I'll read a few more chapters next Wednesday. Ooh, yeah, these people are lost. But this is a really good book. I've read it before and I really enjoyed it. So I think that you guys will like it when we especially get to the part where she joins People's Temple and some more, extra stuff. So anyway, I will, like I said, I'll begin my Nature Boy. Nature Boy, Lord have mercy. So I'll begin I'll do a next reading next Wednesday. I'm gonna try to do a reading every Wednesday. And then yeah. So like I said, I dual stream this on my Auntie 3, my true crime channel. And then I'll probably make this one on this main channel sub uh, for what is it? For members only, since it's kind of weird to have it on on here on this one. But anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and head off so I can lay down. You guys have a wonderful rest of your day, and I really appreciate it, and y'all letting me share some of my weird hobbies with you.
Drums, please.